Hey, Phil G and Tears, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So we have moved into our next little G&T series, trying to understand this little thing called Christianity. We got here because all of 2025 for us has been one big series, America, what the hell? And in trying to understand the different ingredients that sort of went into the shit salad of 2025 in America, we get to this point of really talking about the toxic aspects of Christianity, which we started last episode, because it is one of the little ingredients that went into this particular nasty combo that made up 2025. And we've been trying to like do things to help all of us understand that better. But this raises a really interesting question, which we're going to try to continue to explore, and we'll see how long it takes us to do this. But I think it's really one of the fascinating subjects, which is okay, there's a toxic Christianity. There's obviously non-toxic Christianities, but you get to the point of asking, like, what's the real Christianity? And that's what we're going to try to start exploring in these episodes. We're going to try to explore this idea of what is the answer to the question, what is the real Christianity? And the answer may very likely turn out to be there is no such thing as the real Christianity.
Well, that's
And we'll
that's
explore that what
definitely
it means
true.
as we go along.
Spoiler
Yeah.
alert, there is no real Christianity. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
It's been very striking to, okay, let me do the thing and then we'll
Yeah.
continue on. But before we do all those, get into all those rich details of stuff we're going to talk about, if you could please do all the things that everyone asks you, like and subscribe, share something with a friend, maybe give us a little five-star review to help out your hardworking spiritual friends in Jin and Tantra. That would be greatly appreciated. Yeah, otherwise, yeah, totally like spoiler alert. Don't want to
Yeah.
ruin it, but
Yeah.
yeah. I think that this whole subject matter is fascinating, though, like when you really get to the point of realizing, when you really understand it, that there's, well, we're going to get to it as we go.
Yeah.
Last episode was sort of more about the toxic authoritarian Christianities, just to kind of like talk about that. And I had some interesting conversations about that. One of our things we were trying to get to last week was when you talk about toxicity in spiritual systems or really any system, because I was talking with some people I know from the Soviet Union, and they were like, we had our own religion over there called Sovietism, and it was authoritarian and toxic too. And they just kind of took out the Trinity and put in Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and it was the same thing. And I was like, okay, kind of fascinating. So it can really happen in any spiritual system.
But even the idea of the Trinity itself was brought like really put forth as an argument at the Council of Nicaea and like was it 400 or 500?
Yeah, I think they're debating like that's part of it. It really had to do with this idea. Again, I was doing my research around this, but
Yeah.
it had to do a lot with like two different arguments. One was Jesus like part of God and they're the same, or was Jesus sort of a slightly lesser divinity on the hierarchy? And they were debating the shit out of that point.
Right. But this
It's
idea
called
it's
like Arianism versus, would be the Orthodox position of the Trinity. Anyways, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, no, but this position it was not is not a standard view of everybody. It developed and I think in my research anyways and you
Mhm.
can speak for
Yeah.
yourself. Religions evolve. There
Yeah.
there isn't orthodoxy. Well, if you're orthodox and you believe in the Trinity, Jesus never talked about that.
Yeah.
Didn't. So are you a follower of what he said or of what was said after he said what he said? Which to me is not really Christianity because Jesus Christ was the person who the religion is based on, and yet it's influenced by so many other people, in particular Paul, Paulianity might make more sense in my opinion, but it just the evolution of how where things go we can never really know and we're so far removed and these things are so far entrenched in culture in government in just the zeitgeist you know that it's like now they're almost intractable and the idea that like they weren't always this way almost seems blasphemous but they weren't always this way.
Yeah. I find it fascinating to think that like thousands of years of human culture are really made up of these very, slightly rando things that are evolved out of other slightly rando things. I wanted to do something. Let me throw it off of you because this really gets to the whole point of like historicity. So
Yeah,
let me like throw it at you and you'll give me your perspectives on this. And maybe we'll double back to even the things like the Trinity and figure out where these fit in the story too.
sure.
Because it's a wild story. But I agree with you on the point. Like one of the things that I think is amazing to cover this subject matter is what you I think it's a Buddhist insight or a tantric insight or a something insight, a philosophical insight where you realize like so many things are like so tenuous within this, right?
Yeah,
And it's so, as you were pointing out, so woven into the culture, right? It can feel blasphemous, or when you really take a step back, and I want to double back to this later, but we live in a Christian culture, whether you think you're Christian or not, you're still living within this paradigm, and it's all so contingent about how it all set up. But let me do a little bit on historicity just to do it,
yeah,
and I'll get your feedback on this too.
yeah.
So, okay, a little on historicity overall. So, okay. So the point on one of the first points about this, and if you don't know anything about this, this is like a genuinely fascinating story. Like sometimes I think they call it the Jesus story. The movie's like the greatest story ever told. And this is like part of the greatest story ever told, like from a different point of view, because it's amazing how it plays out. So if we think about, what do we first have knowing anything about JC? And this happens in the 50s, right? When you start to get
50,
like
50 AD, not 1950s.
yeah, not 1950s, 80, the real first 50s. Yeah. And so we're talking like 20 years after the death of Jesus, if there is a Jesus, and we'll talk about mythicist positions too, because there are people who say, well, maybe there's no character at all. But in any case, we're talking about in the 50s. And our first person for this, if you don't know anything about this, is what you bring up, Daniel, Paul, right? Is the first person to start writing these things. And if you don't know anything about this, again, it's an amazing story because you might not know it, but does Jesus ever meet Paul? The answer is no.
No,
Jesus and Paul never cross paths. Of course, the famous story is Paul has a vision on the way into Damascus and falls off his horse, and it's a whole big whoop-de-doo, right? All comes from visionary experience. So Paul's thing is all based on like visionary experience.
and
You know,
even Paul's stories are based on Greek myth.
if we want to double back to it, but maybe that's to be continued. You could debate those questions, right?
Yeah,
Let me like I'll do it. Maybe we'll double back on the Greek
sure,
myth part.
sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Um, So, and when you look at him like in like what he writes about, he writes very little about Jesus's life at all.
Correct.
He doesn't really seem to know very much about him. He knows that he's crucified, and a lot of it comes to the point of like, which I guess we'll get to, but what does Paul think any of this means? But he's like he doesn't really know him. He's writing in Greek. Jesus would have been like an Aramaic speaker in Jerusalem 20 years earlier. And Paul is writing in Greek. So even when he writes this kind of letters to the Romans, he's like in Greece, but he's traveling all over the place. The only thing you really get of any contact, and I don't know, this is like in your wheelhouse, Daniel, so I'll be curious to hear what you say about it. But there is this question of whether or not he meets James, who may be the brother of Jesus,
They
right?
said, yeah, James the Just. They said they
It's
met.
a weird thing. So I was looking at this from different historical perspectives,
Sure.
right? It's kind of like an oddly open question. I wanted to bring it up. So what happens is there's a part where Paul says, I didn't meet any apostles, only James, a brother of the Lord. And there's sort of this funny question of like, is that James like the brother of Jesus or not the brother of Jesus? There's a historian named Richard Carrier. I'm just going to throw him out here because he talks about this idea that, probably that wasn't translated right in the Greek. There are people who argue about that. And it isn't
Yeah.
obvious whether he's talking a brother of the Lord in terms of like a title,
Right.
or like a biological brother, through Mary or something. So even that is a little bit up in the air. But whether you take that one way or the other, one of the odd things in the whole story is that Paul meets presumably these people who knew Jesus, but he doesn't care what they say.
Right.
He like deliberately doesn't listen to them. And they debate about what it is that Jesus taught or thought or meant if he did meet these people.
Correct. Yeah.
So it's a very odd story to have this guy who has these visionary experiences who's then arguing with the people who presumably knew the person that he's saying is this divine figure. And he spends a lot of time debating with them. and like disagreeing with them for whatever that means, right? It's a very curious story. Anyways, I thought throw it back to you. It's really kind of amazing. If you don't know anything about it, it's jaw-dropping.
Yeah. Yeah, and this really is, and if, these are, I don't know, interesting conversations, but this really is very, very, very reflective of the allegory of the cave, Plato's allegory of the cave. Allegory of the cave, as we've talked about before, people are living, essentially in a cave, kind of like tied to a rock, and all they ever see is these uh, shadow figures on the wall that are cast by people's, hands over a fire. So they're casting shadows against a wall, and people are always trying to figure these out, and they don't understand, and yada yada. Somebody gets out of the cave. They go into the daylight. It's blinding to them. They're completely disoriented. It's hard, very hard for them to fathom that there's a life outside of this cave. And then when they go back and try and convince the other people that this is the case, they don't believe them, and they're arguing with him. That sounds exactly like this, like verbatim. Just change the character, change the story, but the exact principles are the same thing. And there's just a lot of this tradition and a lot of many traditions that borrow from previous traditions. That's why I talked about earlier on the evolution of religion, where it comes from and where it ends up. That I think without doing a deeper dive or without the tradition expressing the seeds from which it gets its information from, you will assume, or at least it is my assumption, that people will think or believe that this starts where they said it started. But that's just not true. And it doesn't actually diminish the experiences or the words coming from any of these particular people. That's your choice to believe what you want. However, it does give context to the human psyche and how it is that we learn through stories and what it is that we do when we're faced with something new and bright and shiny and different. We fight against it, and then we assimilate it. So it's yeah, I'll let you.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be one thing of like interpreting. I think if you don't know anything about it, it's shocking. I'll do the Gospels.
Yep.
So we'll continue on the vibe, right? So if you don't know anything about this, the Gospels, so we have Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, right? The four Gospels that make up, that part of the New Testament. And they're written later than Paul, right? The standard like historical understanding of this is they're written probably starting in like the 70s. So we're talking like not the 70s again, like bell bottoms and disco and shit, but the 70s like AD.
Yeah.
And this idea that like you're talking now 40 years later after, the primary figure for whom these things are presumably written about are gone. They're written in Greek. They're written by people who obviously didn't know Jesus. It's not obvious like who they would have known who would be second or third hand stories, but they're supposed to be second or third hand. No one knows who wrote these things, which isn't always obvious to people, right? They're called Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And I'm saying it in that order because that's presumably the order they were written. Mark probably first in the 70s, and people don't know when these other ones come up, but maybe they tend to say like maybe about 10 years apart. No one really knows. But Matthew will be next, and then Luke, and then John. So you're getting like by the end a long way away from whoever the people
Yeah.
were who were originally involved in the story. But if you don't know anything about this, it's really kind of amazing because they're under these names, but they're not really written by those people.
Right.
And no one thinks they are. So what happened was that these books were kind of when they became canonized or in the process of them becoming canonized, people kind of just said like, well, okay, this one I'm going to say is written by Mark, who is supposed to be someone who's associated with Peter. And this one's going to be written by Luke, who's someone who's supposed to be associated with Paul. The other two are apostles. Where do those names come from? It's not claimed by the authors. It isn't obvious who wrote them. And if you don't know anything about that, that's also shocking because you would think, okay, that one should be written by those exact people. They're not,
They're
right?
not.
And
And
historically,
also,
that's kind of a known fact that they're not.
Eric,
So,
also keep in mind at that time in history, life expectancy was much lower.
well, that's a debatable point too. This
Is
goes back
it?
to civilized to death. I was having this
Oh, yeah.
conversation about you look up people like Isaac Newton lived into his 70s or his 80s. A lot of, so if like a lot of that life expectancy stuff was if you died young. So like we can like look that up maybe in some other episode, but it's kind of a thing. If you survived, you might live to be pretty old. And it's kind of astonishing when you look at like a lot of the people, you're like, wow, that dude lived to 70, that dude lived to 80. A lot of that birth stuff happened because people would die young.
Right.
So sometimes you hear people say that everyone died in their 40s or something, and then you look and you're like, well, are these all outliers, all these old geezers running around? It's like it depended on what happened. But if
Sure.
you made it through your young life, a lot of times you would live to be longer.
Mm.
And it's funny when you look that up. I was just looking up some of the people around that exact point. And again, it's argument that people make. A lot of times that those numbers look worse because so many kids die when they're
Died. Right.
young.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Famine
So it
and
skews it.
disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you were made it to a certain point, you might live to like what we'd expect to be normal life expectancies
Sure.
now, and then people die. It was again, I was just this is a tangent, of course, but I was looking at like the dude who played Black Panther died of cancer. Is it
Chadwick
Chadwick
Boseman.
Boseman?
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's really shocking. You think about these life expectancy things, and then you watch people that we know within our lifetimes who die of these things. It's kind of a crapshoot probably the whole
Yeah.
time. But anyways, it's an interesting point. I don't know, like if you look at that longevity question I'm trying to bring up, I don't know how that would affect these people. It's a good, Jesus didn't make it that long.
Right.
That's for another reason.
Another reason why we're here.
Yes, that's why we're talking about him. But anyways, I mean, other things would happen. So, but it's an interesting question, though. I wonder about that question too about life expectancies in that talking that way. I just heard someone bringing that up, but um, so we got these four gospels, and yeah, I was just doing this a little bit, beforehand, and it's a kind of an interesting exercise. Maybe you can try it on your own if you don't have any experience with this kind of stuff. But and we'll explore it as we go, maybe. But they all tell different stories, and it's kind of amazing if you don't know about this. And now we have our little Google searches. It's pretty easy to do it. But Bart Ehrman, who's one of the historians of the New Testament, who I'm kind of using as one of my touchstones for this. Daniel, I know you have your touchstones too,
Yeah.
right? But he has a great line where he talks about the Gospel of John versus the other Gospels. And in the first three of those Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, which are sometimes called the synoptic Gospels, which means something like they can be looked at together because they're so similar. It's obvious that those people were sharing sources.
Right.
And it seems like Luke and Matthew were looking at Mark, the first of these, because there's like verbatim passages that are just coming out of Mark into these other books. So people are like, okay, crack the code. These people were looking at this other book, and then they were adding or subtracting things according to whatever they wanted to do.
Sure.
John is considered to be really different.
Yeah.
John is the one where Jesus is going around saying, I'm God all the time. And the other ones, he never says anything like that. So you have to get to John, and John's, of course, very famous for like the beautiful passages that people love. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. These kind
Right.
of very poetical things that's in John. Could be a fascinating book, even. It's not even a critique of it, but it's different, right? And in that story, Jesus is running around I should say story. In that gospel, Jesus is running around talking all the time about how he's God. And Bart Ehrman has this great line like, what happened to the first three gospels? Did they just forget to include that part?
Right.
And that they just thought that wasn't important to mention? That's a good line. But the funny thing that you can do, maybe as an experiment, is if you think of any famous story that you think about with Jesus, you can always do what happened in these other gospels? Did they just forget to mention that part?
Right.
So I was looking at Sermon on the Mount, right, as a starting point. And you can all do this for yourself, but that one's only in Matthew. It's not in the other three. Did they forgot to mention that part?
Right. Yeah. Were they not? Were they not? Well, none of them were there, but
Did they miss it that day?
yeah.
Yeah. So Sermon on the Mount only there. The virgin birth stories, not in John, not in Mark, only in Luke and Matthew, and they're totally different. And if you don't know that, that's a shocker too. And we can talk about
Yeah.
how they're different maybe at some other time.
Yeah.
So that's different. Think of any other famous story, like the Golden Rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Not in Mark, not in Luke, or not in Mark, not in John. They're only in Matthew and Luke, probably because they were copying like either from each other or they were copying from other source where that shows up. Um, The Lord's Prayer, which I said as a like a Catholic kid, is that in all the Gospels? No.
No,
It's only in Luke and Matthew. It's not in Mark and John. They forgot to like include that part in the story.
they left it out on accident.
Yeah, that was like an oversight. Render under Caesar's only in the three synoptic Gospels. The woman taken in adultery only in John. Who did Jesus raise from the dead? Lazarus. Only in John. The
Yeah.
other freak forgot to bring that point up.
Yeah.
Um,
Small point to exclude, but
yeah, they forgot that part. Yeah, and you can continue on with it, right? Like
right,
take almost anything that you know. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount is really shocking, right? I mean, some of the most beautiful passages again that you have, and it's
right.
only in one. Woman in adultery only in John. Uh, Render under Caesar what is to be Caesar's. John doesn't include that. Forgot to mention it. Rich man through the eye of a needle. John doesn't have that one either. And it continues on this way.
Yeah, yeah,
It's kind of fascinating when you really like take it apart. And if you don't know anything about this, it's like quite shocking, right? Where you realize like, you know, take on anything that you know and you start to realize, well, that's just a little thing in that one story that was written, decades later that that author tried to include. I did a couple of the other ones. Walking on the Water isn't in Luke.
you got enough. You got enough.
No, I'm into it, dude. I'm gonna continue to go. I don't give a fuck. I'm going because I think it's fucking fascinating. What else do you know? Turning water into wine only in John. Name anyone you got. Try it for yourself. The Good Samaritan only in Luke. The other ones forgot. Try it. Do it for yourself. Choose the most famous thing you know about Jesus, and you'll find that this is the answer. And I think this raises this like really profound question, which is like kind of a big one for me, and you'll have your own feeling about this too, Daniel, I know. But like one of the things I've been noticing in looking at this is that there's a lot of people who are talking now about this idea. Well, let's find like the real Jesus.
Right.
Who's the real Jesus? And like again, through the exercise we were just doing with this, there is no real Jesus. Gone, right? So whoever that person was, and I'm like very empathetic on this point. I've been listening to people who, again, broke away from sort of these Christian nationalist circles, and they keep going, people are following Paul, but not Jesus, or
Correct.
people are trying to like not follow the real Jesus. And what you ultimately realize is there is no real Jesus, y'all. There's no person there, or whoever that person was is gone. And the historian ways of talking about this is just to say, yeah, we all realize that there's all of these other inclusion of these other events that probably were traditions that developed that people included in these stories. Maybe it was
Yeah.
part of one community, not part of another. And we can try to like scrape this away to try to find who this real person is. And again, I'm empathetic on how people you feel an emotional attachment to a spiritual figure. I get it. But it's also the part of the truth of like that person, if you want to look at it as a historical thing, is gone.
Right.
You're not going to know anything about that person. So there is no real Jesus to find in the end of all of this. I know, I'll throw it out to you, Daniel. I mean, what do you think about that whole thing? I find that to be astonishing, and I don't find it to be something that like people talk about.
Yeah, I feel like it's an eternally moving target, first of all. Second, we're all going to have different perspectives. So we'll use you for an example. Your son sees you differently than your daughter does. Sees you, different than the mother of your children does. Sees you different than your own mother does. Different than I do, different than some of your students. And how people look at you will inherently change how they represent you to other people. So we don't talk about him too much, and we're not going to now. But like, your brother's older or younger, Eric?
He's younger.
He's
He's younger,
younger.
6 years younger than me.
So he's going to have a very different perspective of you than many other people for many
Yeah, yeah, for
reasons.
sure.
But one
Yeah.
that he grew up with you, you guys shared a household, you had some similar traumas. He might have a totally different experience. You maybe fought over certain things, whatever, So his view of you is very different. How he's going to explain you to somebody else who has no idea who you are is going to sound different than perhaps, somebody who's, went to school with you for several years, took a bunch of classes with you, was in clinic with you, learned with you. You have to change their life. that's a totally different perspective. So where is the real person? I don't know, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. The real person is only to be had by those who were around them first. So just from a, a perspective, I guess a commentary on perspective. But then the second part that brings us maybe more to this argument is that the differences, the vast differences from the way that these people saw him does have to make you question how is something that would we would consider a miracle, which is what the religion itself considers a miracle, not be mentioned? Why are some things mentioned multiple times and other things only mentioned once by one particular author? When those things that are mentioned once, like, raising somebody from the dead and giving sight to the blind and so on and so forth, only mentioned in one, I would imagine, again, just being a human, that these would be mentioned by numerous people. So it is sort of odd that it's not shared by more than one. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I think like the part that I find amazing about it is it's because, I mean, the obvious thing to say, if you want to like look at it historically, is because these stories are made up. It's not like the one part I think in your analogy, I think it's interesting. Like you name a person, you say, well, different people see different parts of that person will describe different things. We're talking about people writing in Greek about an Aramaic person who died decades earlier, who they didn't know, who maybe had like they had stories through some oral tradition. And, again, I've been really influenced by like people who are doing this from the historical perspective because I think it's fascinating and it has its own power to it, right? Who are like really writing spiritual texts that are part of like the creation of themselves or their own community in which they're involved with. And, have tangential relationships to a historical figure if there was a historical figure to begin with in the first place.
Right.
So I mean, I love the analogy of looking like different people will see different parts of a person. In this case, though, we're really talking about like from like again, the historical person's point of view. We're talking about things that are written decades and decades later
Right.
about a person that they never knew,
Right.
right? That are like things that are like in some ways written as documents to tell a story,
Right.
you know, about to make a spiritual point, right? And have like tenuous relationships back to like any historical person at all.
Well,
And that's just kind of how it is.
I don't know how think about this, but I actually think that there is more value in the allegory than in a literal translation, particularly here. And I've always felt this way. I've always, again, the beliefs I have now are very close to when I was a kid, and that these things have far more power as a story to teach than they do as a historical document about a particular time in history with one particular person. Because now I have to critique it as a document, essentially. It's a documentary, right? And you can critique a documentary because we are historical loving people. We're a historical loving culture. I mean, not everybody, but generally speaking, there's tons of archaeologists, and we love to wonder how how did they build the pyramids, and how did this happen, and we want to know, right? We're sort of obsessed with ourselves. You know what I'm saying? And now they're saying like, oh, and there's a story of this one guy who was actually God, but he was a human, but he was also God, but he was also totally just like you, but not like you at all. You're scum. He's perfect, but not you. You're trash. Thank him. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a another way to like, I don't know, wrap yourself with yourself to feel like, oh, that could be me. I feel like people have this kind of idea around it. Yeah, it's just sort of fascinating, I guess, to me how people will dismiss one or the other, but miss the point when you do that. So looking at it as a historical document, we can critique it. Looking at it as a story, we can learn from it. But there at least seem to me not that many people who can be flexible enough to say, well, there's probably some historical person that, as a historical document, probably not the best. But as a teaching tool, it's probably good. but maybe not perfect. But if you do that, then you're looked at as like, how dare you? Of course he was a man born in the year -3 and died in the year +30 and did X, Y, and Z. And, oh, by the way, we can't account for like 2/3 of his life. Sorry. You know what I
But
mean?
I
Like,
mean,
it's crazy.
even if you get to the two-thirds of his life, you're talking about things like these are fictional stories.
Right.
But I was very impressed with like, again, like we all have our touchstones that we use when we're prepping these things. You and I do, and we all have our touchstones in life. But I was very influenced by like listening to some of these historians of this talk about
Yeah.
this. And like I like Bart Ehrman a lot, and he makes a kind of very profound point. He says the general way that people tend to do this is they go through and they want to take, all of these different sub stories, the Mark one, the Matthew one, the
Yeah.
Luke one, and they just want to blend it into one like mega story and like kind of ram all the pieces together. Uh, and his point is that when you do that, you lose the fact that Mark was writing to have a certain point. There was something he was trying to communicate. Matthew told a different story because there was something else he was trying to communicate. And then Luke and John, accordingly, right? They have different messages that they're trying to get across that could have different spiritual import,
Right.
right? What
Right.
they're trying to communicate. And if you like kind of lose that and you try to like put them all into a blender and mix them all together, you lose the fact of what that spiritual document is supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
In the chase for what you were kind of talking about before, in the chase for sort of like a historicity that doesn't exist, right?
Yes.
And then you end up with so anyways, I think I don't know. We'll see how this fits with other people. I know for me, this was like, I was raised as a Catholic kid,
Yeah.
and this was fascinating for me. I was like, oh, this is how this really is. I wasn't Catholic anymore, but I still felt my own emotional connections to my roots, right?
Sure.
Nothing wrong with that. I felt affected by the things that I did. And it's not to be something where you still can't have things that you believe with and connect with and you love within this. I was just sort of touched by the idea of people. Again, it's been a big thing that has crossed my path where people are going like, well, this has become the Jesus of Paul and not the religion of Jesus, and the religion of Jesus is in the Gospels. And I'm like, the Gospels are written after Paul, y'all,
Right.
right? By people who don't have any direct contact at all, right? And once you start to really take that apart, you start to realize, okay, what really happened here
Yeah.
within these stories? And it's actually, I maybe it's the zen of it for me too. It's kind of mind blowing, especially when you look at like how the influences of these things have like moved through the millennia, right?
Yeah.
Without us really, again, if you never heard this before, it's mind blowing, right? Yeah. So I know, where do you want to go next? You want to talk about the different kinds of Christianities that were available at the time, or do you want to talk about how they are the different Jesuses in the Gospels, or where do you want to go with it, or you want to just let it hang?
Yeah, I think we'll let it hang for now, just given the time.
Yeah, yeah,
Those are longer than 5-minute pieces.
yeah, for sure.
You know what I mean? So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I mean, anyways, for the closer
Yeah.
on it, it's something astonishing, and I think what I don't know what it means. So maybe this is like we got a couple minutes left. I don't know what it
Sure.
means for there to be like no real person at the heart of this, where everyone else is going to have to come up with whatever they think this person means to them.
Right.
It's wild to think of what that actually means.
So I'm going to go back to the beginning of our conversation when we talked about the Council of Nicaea, when they were discussing the Trinity, what it
Mm.
was, what it is, all of this. I've heard different arguments, as I'm sure you have. Some of the more, I don't want to say nihilistic, but I'm going to use that word just for purposes of this conversation, said that it was created and disseminated and really pushed because it's illogical.
That's a
And
kind of a standard take. It's supposed to be like a paradox.
correct.
I know like in church it was always this part, and if you have flashbacks to church, I apologize, but it was always like, let us explore the mystery of faith is the way this is done when I was a
Oh,
kid.
beautiful. Yes.
And then we would go through and we'd explore the mystery of faith,
Ah, like
which is that this is not supposed to be crackable, right?
right.
Yeah.
But there that, and from who I heard it from definitely is a little bit more of a, pessimist, but they said that it was their interpretation that not only was this done on purpose to be illogical, it was done on purpose to push people's questioning aside to say, well, you don't understand it. So don't bother questioning it. You can't understand it. It's not for you to understand. Don't worry about it. Just believe it. And that this aspect of the faith is belief in miracles, belief in things that you don't understand. That's it. That's it. And that really is disempowering from a user perspective. Meaning, if I'm going to use this faith in my life, which I think is the point, I could be wrong. Let's go back to what, Mr. Jesus said about these things. Oh, wait, no one knows. Um, you know, but it's from what they say, Gospel of Thomas or something else like this, that you're supposed to use it. But when you have to question the core and it's intentionally ambiguous, the argument for this is say, well, this is a divine providence that your human mind simply can't understand. Well, then why can't we kick it around and have discussions around it? No, no, sir. We cannot do that. I find that to be, it seems to me, and again, perhaps I'm a bit pessimistic, intentionally misleading. Intentionally misleading to keep the congregation always in a bit of a state of a confusion. And therefore, they are easier to manipulate or control. And we are having a discussion about Christianity in relation to Christ as a person and the stories associated with him. But what is also happening simultaneously in our discussion, and it's not in this discussion, it was in the one previous, and I'm sure it'll come back again, it's the evolution of the faith as a religious practice, but it's also evolution of the faith from a social perspective as it begins to merge into government.
What you might call like a mechanism of control.
Yes.
And I've wondered about this too, because if you set this thing up where it's so when it is so illogical, whatever your intention is, right?
Whatever it is,
You
yeah.
can be charitable or not charitable about
Sure.
that. But if you have set up a system where it doesn't make any sense purposely, right?
Purposeful, yeah.
Then you're like undermining the critical thinking apparatus of the people who are going to be the participants in that.
Hmm.
And I've wondered about that. Like once that hits you, okay, so that's how maybe whatever the intentions were, or whatever people were arguing, they were arguing this. It seems like historically, they were arguing this abstract point.
Yes.
Arius said that Jesus was below God, and this pissed some other people off, and then other people were like, no, they all have to be equal, whatever that meant.
Right.
And then Constantine is there, like, you all got to like have a council
Yes.
and straighten this shit out because I'm not going to have you all arguing about this stuff and ruining the religion of my state, which I
Correct.
now have adopted to be the religion of my state.
Yes.
So whatever the intention was, maybe it would have been more logical to say the father is on the top and the son underneath, but that didn't win. The other one won for whatever the reasons were. And but I have wondered about like the once you start undermining rationality, and maybe this is where we come from somewhat in what you get in something like Buddhist Tantra or in Taoism, you can be a rational person within that. But if you
Yes.
break the rationality gears, what does that do to people, right?
Yes.
When you break them. And then the other part, and I guess we'll go on as we do this, because it's again, it's kind of a fascinating thing. Like, well, how did people, what were all the different versions that had exploded out of this? You
Yes.
know, but you end up with a bunch of people that no matter what you try to conclude about it, you're a heretic.
Yes.
So if you believe, well, God is on top and Jesus is second, guess what? Heretic, right? And everything gets labeled a heresy. So you always have people on the defensive. And
Yeah.
one of the guys I like a lot was making the point about like no matter what, when you talk to people now about how they try to like piece together their faith for themselves,
Yeah.
right? What you inevitably find out is they're doing some heresy one way or another. Like,
Yes.
oh, that's that heresy, that's that heresy to be continued. But I don't know what that does to people. I think it's a really interesting point, Daniel. And I had the same questions in my mind. Like
I
what
just,
happens once you get this kind of process going? What does that do to people?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah. I mean, because everything really comes down to what is your path,
Yeah.
your personal path. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're Catholic, it doesn't, you still have your own path. You could be totally, like a spiritual free agent, as I like to call myself, or you could be a 100% orthodox in whatever tradition that you want to be in. It's still your path. The way that Eric, you're going to understand something, and the way that I'm going to understand something are going to be slightly different, even if it's the exact same material. You have your life perspective, you have your own internal perspective, your own everything else, right? So the question is like, what is our, like, how does this affect our path towards whatever ends we're wanting it to be? We've talked about this before. What's someone's organizing principle? Right? And you and I both have said that, like, the idea of enlightenment or the idea of gaining betterment such that my compassion could be more effective to help other people, you know, is an aligning principle for my life. That's the overarching theme that I am working on, and I wear those glasses, and those help me to see things better. So the path is what it's about, right? And I wrote this thing the other day. I didn't share this with you before, Eric, but it came out of a classroom of mine, which you are familiar.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm quoting myself now because, I'm doing this. The tapestry of the path is woven with strands of faith. And the way that I saw that was literally a path that we walk on is many threads, many different strands of things that are weaving it together. But there are strands of faith, and it's not the only thing that weaves that path together for us. It's an important part of it, but it's not the only thing. Because for me, faith and doubt work together. The negation of doubt doesn't inherently yield faith immediately. It doesn't. The negation of doubt yields generally confidence, but faith and confidence are not the same thing. So having faith doesn't mean you're getting rid of doubt. Having faith doesn't mean that, that Jesus wasn't an actual human or that he's only a story or that he does exist or that he doesn't. It's not. It's neither one. It's both. Having faith is that, yeah, there's a person, but how does it influence my path? What am I doing? What am I working on? And I think people have a really difficult time accepting responsibility and really asking themselves, like, what is my faith? And more importantly, how does that move me along my path? Or do I even have a path? What even is a path? You know what I'm saying? So I try and keep those two, faith and doubt, those two juxtapositions simultaneous, yin and yang, right? We're Taoists. So that's who's giving this discussion.
I'm really struck by, and we'll get out of here, I know in a second, but
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
really struck by like what's been coming up in a lot of these episodes that we've been recording like towards the last 2 or 3 months, right? Which has been on the one hand, there's an individual level that these can affect you on, right?
yeah,
Part of this is individual, and of course, we think that's very important. Even we had these episodes we did on this thing called the emotional plague from the psychologist Wilhelm Reich. You can check out the episodes if you want. But it's one of these things where you could say, okay, if you have toxic ideas within a culture, within a society, that's what Reich meant by that. That can affect you as an individual, and that can hold you back in terms
yeah,
of your ability to go forward, right?
yeah,
On the other hand, you can also find that you're in a sociocultural setting where these toxic ideas are affecting like across the board. And one of the wild things about this particular one is that, you could see that if you get a toxic version of a spirituality that or a religion that like tries to take everything over, it creates problems for everyone,
right,
right?
right,
And then that becomes a wild thing because then you realize like that version of that religion that's being used by this group of people, like there's no there.
right.
And that's being done in a way that like I suppose could be seen as being opportunistic by the people who are doing that. But I think a lot of times people really believe those things.
Yeah,
Right. I don't think it's a question of always just cynicism. I think people really are so enmeshed in these ideas. And then the shocking thing, I think, from the stuff we've been talking about, the things that shocked me was like when you really go and you investigate it, you find out, oh, wait a minute, there's nothing there in there, right? There's no particular reason why that person should have the advantage of claiming that they have the true religiosity, whichever one you're claiming, right?
Right.
You don't have any right or justification in that because when you really like look at it, there's no there, right? Which means that, like, I suppose on an individual level, you can decide, okay, this is my Jesus. This is what I relate to within this
Correct.
core of teachings.
Right.
And we don't have to have arguments about who's the real one, right? The same way you don't have the arguments of like, okay, I know that's yours. You don't have the right to impose that on everybody else
Correct.
just because that one's yours. All right, so that's my feeling on it. We
I
all
hear
get to
you.
look at it on an individual level, and then we all get to look at like what this means on like a collective level. And that's kind of stunning to think, wow, like tons of people are going to be put under the dominance of a set of ideas that are like this. They've just made it up or
Yeah.
chosen to take that particular version and impose it on others. Well, we all have the choice of our own Jesus. Choose
That's
your
right.
own.
Uh,
Daniel and I probably like Gnostic Jesus, but choose whichever one you want.
a smorgasbord of Jesus eye.
Choose the one that you vibe with.
That's right.
And we
That's
have to
right.
search for the real one. All right, cool. All right, great, Daniel. Thanks so
Yep.
much.
Always, Eric, thank you so much. Audience, thank you for listening, for tuning in, however you catch us. Hit us up, ginandtantra@gmail.com, or hit us on the gram, the Gin and Tantra Podcast. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, do all the things that people ask. We appreciate everybody listening. If you've made it this far, your attention span is in the top 3% of all human beings. And that number is actually going to go down because we're just making more shorter and shorter form content, but not us. We keep it real. And, we appreciate everybody tuning in, especially to the end. So give yourself a pat on the back if you made it this far. And really, genuinely, honestly, I know I say it every time, but we do really appreciate people tuning in. It's nice. And it keeps us motivated. And, yeah, we'll keep doing what we're doing. And if you have a desire for us to cover something or you have a question, please feel free, ginandtantra@gmail.com. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Deuces.